On a rooftop, at dusk, Mary Jane Watson Parker looks out into the city of New York, worried. Aunt May approaches her and asks what's wrong, and MJ explains that she's worried about Peter. This is a feeling Aunt May knows all too well. It's something she first felt when her sister, Peter's mother, first announced she was pregnant. When Aunt May presses for further details, MJ replies that Peter asked her not to say anything. He doesn't want her to worry any more than she needs to. But Aunt May reassures MJ that if MJ needs a shoulder to cry on, Aunt May is here. MJ knows all of this, it's just Peter's going through a lot of changes right now. Peter Parker, the spectacular Spider-Man, has run into a woman with terrifying mutant abilities. Her name is Adriana Soria, also known as the Queen. Her presence has attracted the attention of the military, Captain America, Nick Fury, and S.H.E.I.L.D. But her own interest lies in Spider-Man and his potential as a mate. Very few know the true story behind the Queen, but during World War II, as part of the super soldier experiment, Anna was signaled out for her mutant gene. Left abandoned in a military asylum, Anna developed into a new being with both insect and subhuman properties. She escaped with an ability to control insects and 1/3 of the human population carrying the insect gene. Peter Parker is one of the unlucky few who has such a gene. Ever since he encountered Anna as Spider-Man, a bizarre transformation has begun to occur. After a period of strange dreams, physical changes, and troubling telepathic connection to this Queen, Peter is literally turning into a spider. Now Anna controls a bomb that is threatening to destroy all human life within 600 miles, leaving only animals, insects, and her own followers intact, with her left behind to rule them all. Peter Parker is dying. He can't sleep, he can't breathe. Something is in his skin, and he can't get it out of his mind. His mouth starts to taste like oatmeal and bile, and he can't remember how he got here, who he is, or why he's scared. And one thing seems to concern him more than anything else. He does not want to go home. Then he hears singing, a human sound like insects, calling to him. The Queen is here. She confirms she is indeed the one behind Spider-Man's gruesome and growing transformation. But she promises everything will be alright. He just needs to step into the light with her. When Spider-Man refuses her, the Queen is able to effortlessly grab her foe and toss him into a brick wall. She takes Spider-Man away, saying that she promised he would fall for her. And he did, like a ton of bricks. Not long after this, the Human Torch flies in. He radios into Reed, saying he thought he spotted something, but whatever was here is gone. Cyclops and the X-Men were called in after Professor Xavier got a pale look on his face and told them to come down to the city at once without explaining why. Iron Man was only told by Cap to look for Spider-Man and or this Queen, and it really has him spooked. And judging by the level of cooperation with law enforcement, this is either an alien invasion or the end of the world. Meanwhile, S.H.I.E.L.D. receives a message from the Queen, warning citizens of New York, Boston, Montreal, and Washington that she has a bomb. With the transmission over, Cap says they have a decision to make, whether or not to evacuate. But Nick Fury points out evacuating that kind of area is ridiculous. There's going to be panic and a lot of needless confusion and deaths if they can't just sort this out before they do something like that. Evacuation is pretty much impossible, and instead they decide to focus on the Queen. Still, he's worried. What if they don't find her in time? What if they do? Cap replies that, quite simply, the answer to both is, he doesn't know. In the Queen's lair, known as the Hive, beneath Manhattan, the villainess orders her workers to leave before she travels to a hidden room. She tells Spider-Man that she knows he's afraid of what's going to happen, what's already happened, but there's no point in wishing for the way things were. Those days are over, and there's no going back now. So don't be sad, Spider-Man. You're beautiful. Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and this is my recap and review of the Spectacular Spider-Man number 19. Alright, so this is an interesting pull from our random reviews of issues that Mary Jane has appeared in as a character over the years throughout her history. And yeah, I was really surprised when this infamous little story came along because I've known this story for years by reputation alone, long before I ever even read it. It's the one where Spider-Man turns into a monster and eventually a giant spider, as we see at the end of this issue. And it's kind of infamous for that because it's not particularly good or well regarded as a point in Spider-Man history, and part of a number of stories where Spider-Man goes through a series of horrifying transformations into a slightly more spider-like person. This story is infamous quite correctly. It's not very good and is really weird in a number of key areas. For one thing, it supposes that 1/3 of the human population has some sort of insect gene. I know enough about genetics to know how crazy that is on multiple fronts. For one thing, what do they mean by gene? Like a single genome? That's an insect? That doesn't make sense. Is it somehow referring to humans that have insects in their genetic history? That's just wrong. And the more we try and dissect this comic, the more I have to remember that this comic also insists on a very interesting JFK conspiracy. Not that it was the CIA, but it was a series of mercenaries hired by Cuba, or assassins hired by Cuba. I don't know. It's weird. That's a weird thing to throw out there. And that's probably the easiest way to describe this comic. It's just a very odd animal that doesn't really work for all of these reasons. And for the fact that Spider-Man's turning into a crazy monster and nothing makes sense. The Queen is kind of a cliche, very shallow villain who doesn't really offer much. And none of this stuff really looks good in the context of later stories, such as The Other by J. Michael Straczynski, which would only come out a couple years after this comic was first published in 2004, and stuff like Spider Island or Spider-Verse. These are all decent comics, but all of them are kind of fencing around this idea of Spider-Man turning into something crazy and it being a terrifying experience. This isn't anything new. Changes isn't really demonstrating a brand new storyline in the world of Spider-Man. This stuff has been done before, like in that story where Spider-Man grew 4 extra arms and had to deal with that for a little bit. But this is a good example of the writers trying something different that comics like The Other or Spider Island have attempted in the past, and they really haven't managed to succeed at in some big memorable way just yet. I really think there's a lot of potential to stories like this. While Spider-Man traditionally is more of just an adventure-y sort of hero who fights technologically based supervillains who are basically trying to rob banks, and by and large it's what we've gotten out of these random reviews of Mary Jane comics so far. This comic, and the stories that I've been talking about in this review, aim to present Spider-Man in a very different context, in the sort of thing that you'd expect out of a horror story. And I think there's some real potential here. Yes, Spider-Man is traditionally a happier, healthier superhero, doing more adventurous sort of activities in his day-to-day life. He doesn't always have to be this, and Spider-Man, just like any superhero, doesn't really have to be one thing or just one genre. And I think there's some real potential to explore new ideas like this, and to see Spider-Man in the context of a horror story. Because based on how he got his powers, the bug bite, and his transformation into a human with spider-like properties, there's a real potential for some body-morphing, creepy horror moments that I don't think the comics have done a good job delivering on just yet. These comics, while they fail at what they're trying to do, are really getting close to something I think that could be memorable. I find the idea of a body just uncontrollably transforming and having this pain inside of you and having this permanent thing happen to you that you can't control a really creepy idea, and something that works for me in the horror genre across different media. So to see it happening to Spider-Man, I think there's some potential here, but then I look at this story, its artwork, and how it executes this concept, and I find it doesn't really work. But I think it more of has to do with how this story is written and delivered, rather than the actual quality of the idea in question. Because one day, some writer, preferably one with some sort of experience with horror, is going to take a crack at this sort of story with Spider-Man, and I think they're going to nail it with something that's just going to become one of the all-time greatest Spider-Man stories. Because once you have the basics of Spider-Man down, his personality, his love of science, his general social awkwardness, and how he sort of masks that with humor and banter as a superhero, and the general aspects of him just being some guy who lucked out with some powers and does the best he can with it. If you get all those basics down, you can start to explore other locations and other genres, like they're doing in Spider-Man's next solo movie, Far From Home, which is going to take place abroad in Italy. You can explore and do different things if you have the basics right, and they got all the basics of Spider-Man right in Homecoming. So for them to go in different directions, like Far From Home, I think has a lot of potential. If in a future sequel they wanted to add more horror aspects to Spider-Man's character and the tone in his movies, well, I think it's all right here on paper. They just have to sort of tweak the actual storytelling. So, no, I don't recommend this comic. It's not very good, even under the most generous of circumstances. The writing is loopy and lacks of enough grounding in reality to be anything worth following, and while it's cool seeing all these superheroes looking around for Spider-Man, there isn't really much to this comic. I have no idea what any of this has to do with Avengers Dissassembled, which this comic is apparently a tie-in towards, but that doesn't really matter. The story itself is lacking regardless of whether or not it's a tie-in to Disassembled, which, by the way, I don't really like to begin with. But all this stuff with the Queen isn't very good, and the stuff going on with Spider-Man's transformation is interesting but not played up enough and not executed enough that I'm empathizing with Spider in a way that makes me think, oh no, what's happening to his body, and freaking out about it the way that Paul Jenkins, the writer of this comic, wants me to. Paco Medina does the artwork for this comic, and he does a really good job. It really holds up as artwork. It's just a shame that it's not being used in a clever way to properly execute this comic. The look of Spider-Man as he's transforming, and it's all hairy and drool and teeth and out of control, is good. It's really well done, but the writing doesn't live up to the artwork in question. But even though I'm not recommending this comic, I don't want to be too hard on it, and I don't want us as a fan community to be hostile to future stories and ideas that involve Spider-Man going through kooky transformations or other weird horror beats, because there's some real potential for cool comics along these lines in the future. There are other examples of Spider-Man horror done right in this character's history, but I really think there's something to all this body dysmorphia stuff. We just have to simultaneously avoid either sloppy storytelling like we're seeing here, or even worse, like we get in Spider-Man the Other or Spider-Verse, Peter becoming this big destiny character and all that cliched nonsense that we really don't need in Spider-Man's character. Remember, the whole point of his character is this is just random. This happened to him randomly, and it's a freak genetic accident. And unlike all the other freaks of science Peter fights as villains, Peter chose to use what happened to him for good. That's a core principle of his character. Finally, as for Mary Jane, she is only in the beginning of this comic, but it's a real sincere and moving part. While I've mentioned that I don't really think that it was for the best that they resurrected Aunt May, she is used effectively here to show how Spider-Man, Aunt May, and Mary Jane have become a true family unit. These two characters, Aunt May and Mary Jane, would find more and more to do in the early 2000s as characters involved in Spider-Man's life, as he became an Avenger and they started living in the Avengers Tower and becoming part of Spider-Man's superhero life as much as they are a part of Peter's life. This is the key moment that I've been talking about so far in these random reviews of Mary Jane comics. It started in the 90s, since they've been married since that time, but like I mentioned in the Punisher review, there's been a bit of a pattern with Mary Jane just staying home and not really being a part of Spider-Man's life. As of this time period, this is when Mary Jane really started to get more and more involved with the day-to-day life of Spider-Man, and it really felt like she was a huge part of this story because of it. It's a shame that the one comic we happen to pull of this era, or even this series of Spectacular Spider-Man comics by Paul Jenkins, is the Changes storyline, because it's the one that really doesn't work, along with a handful of others, including One More Day, which would, of course, erase the marriage between Peter and Mary Jane. A marriage that was built on a relationship that started all the way back in 1973 at the start of these random reviews. But no, those days are over as of now, and we must move forward, and on to the Dan Slott era of Spider-Man comics, where Mary Jane really wasn't a part of Peter Parker's life anymore, yet of course she would still appear from time to time. So next up is a pretty big comic in Spider-Man history, an interesting issue for both Spider-Man and Mary Jane, and the end of their marriage. So stay tuned for that, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.